Good evening. My name is Victoria Paris, and tonight we travel to 18th century Russia, where Yelena the baker has prepared a feast to remember. So cozy up under the blankets and settle in for a wonderful night of sleep. When you're all ready, close your eyes. It was the first day of summer in the small village of Malinka, just outside the imperial city of Zvezdar. Early morning sun cast streaks of lavender and eggshell blue across the sky, no clouds in sight. Flowers bloomed in the light, their sweet scent wafting through the dewy streets. The wishing fountain in the town square gurgled calmly, hundreds of copper pennies glinting underwater. Chickadees chirped, and golden sunbeams bathed the slatted roofs of cottages in warmth. All across Malinka, the townspeople were waking up, stretching and yawning as they rubbed sleep from their eyes. It was a special day, a day of celebration and joy. The first day of summer meant only one thing. The esteemed and beloved imperial family would soon be arriving. The royal family spent the warm months at their summer palace, a magnificent estate only a little ways down the road from Malinka. The 18th century palace was a spectacular feat of architecture. Imagined with the eye of an artist, it was built with elegant gilded stucco, bright sky blue walls, and beautiful snow-white columns. Polished marble staircases led down to the palace's hanging gardens, surrounded by manicured lawns, stone terraces, and private ponds shaded with wisteria and willow trees. It was the perfect, restful getaway for the royal family, and the townspeople of Malinka took a certain pride in having them around during their yearly vacation. In the village abuzz with preparation, children played hopscotch in the town square as their mothers and fathers briskly started the day's tasks. The mayor planted daisies and peonies along the cobbled roadside, knowing that a cavalcade of carriages would soon be making their way to the summer palace. The seamstress practiced her loop knots on fresh linen, perfecting the complex stitch just in case the royal family needed a quick mend. Just outside of town, the village musician sang classical folk songs, her voice soft and sweet. Out in the fields, the farmer ploughed fresh wheat, gathering the rich grain for bread. Every Malinka resident had something amazing to offer, a skill or craft that they alone had mastered. They couldn't wait to share it with their beloved rulers. One such villager was Yelena the baker. It was widely agreed that Yelena's pastry shop was the best in town, maybe even the best in all of Zvezdar. Yelena was one of those people born with a knack for something, an instinct that could only be described as an inherent talent. The more spiritually inclined townspeople whispered that the baker had been blessed by God. Yelena was careful never to confirm or deny the idea. After all, it was good for business. Rye bread, tea cakes, fritters, jams, honey loaves, walnut cookies, she mastered it all. That day was special for her too. It wasn't often that she could try some of her more experimental recipes, but every summer the royal family asked her to bake to her heart's content. Andrei the Great, the Tsar of Russia, had a particular weakness for Yelena's raisin and pecan scones, a weakness he gladly gave into every year. Sophia I, his wife and Empress Regent of Russia, was more partial to Yelena's savoury pies, especially the chive and mutton. Sophia and Andrei, as they kindly asked the villagers to call them while they were on vacation, would stroll down to Yelena's shop at least once a day, sometimes more. Sophia often joked that she left the summer palace significantly plumper than when she arrived. As the sun rose over Malinka that summer morning, the streets were rich with the comforting scent of freshly baked bread. It was all Yelena's doing, of course. She had been baking since long before dawn. From the bakery's kitchen, she watched the sun bathe her flowering window boxes in warm light. A monarch butterfly fluttered over to briefly land on a blooming rose, winking its speckled orange wings at her. It rested for a single breath, then flitted away into the sunlight. She turned her attention back to the task at hand, literally at hand. It was time to knead the bread dough on the countertop in front of her. Yelena was particularly pleased with the texture of this one. It was light and fluffy, promising a smooth, supple and springy crumb. She often made dense breads for the villagers, like rye-studded loaves with sunflower seeds, or whole wheat with cracked oats, or barley with a touch of millet. It was the best way to get nutrients in the cold Russian winters. But this bread was different. She had saved some refined white flour to try a new recipe, intending on gifting a basket of freshly baked goods to Andre and Sophia when they arrived. And she would add ripe fruits from the town's garden and forest beyond, a hand-picked mixture of apples, raspberries and cherries. Her mouth watered just thinking about it. She knew the Demidovs would be equally excited for such a treat. Yelena dusted her hands with flour and began to knead the dough. There was something so peaceful and fulfilling about the task. She pushed the bread away with the heel of her palm, folded it over itself with deft fingers, and pulled it back towards her body. As she worked, the repeated push and pull of the sticky dough began to work it into a perfect, chewy texture. When she was satisfied with the grain, Yelena added fruit. The cherries she had removed seeds from earlier and the raspberries were almost overripe, but not quite. She squeezed each berry slightly before adding it, letting the sweet juices spill over her fingers and colour the dough with swirls of deepest magenta and red. She covered the pretty dough with a swath of clean linen. It had to rise for an hour or two before it could be baked. In the meantime, she had to stoke the fire to a high temperature, then make sure she had the rest of the mouth-watering treats planned and at the ready. She was looking forward to seeing the look on Sophia and Andre's faces when they tried some of her new recipes. For that matter, she was looking forward to seeing the look on her neighbours' faces too. Yelena nipped outside to wash her hands in the town square's water barrel. Children ran to her, burying their faces in her skirt, and she smiled. She asked how one girl's family was faring, and complimented a boy on tying his shoelaces with neat and careful bunny ears. The baker attracted children like moths to a flame. Maybe it was because of her cheerful demeanour, or her silly jokes, or her motherly instincts. But more likely, it was because she always smelled like sweets. And when it came right down to it, she usually kept a few goodies in her pockets anyhow. She had a visitor back in the shop. It was Malinka's resident blacksmith, Ivan. He was a large man with a gentle voice, kind demeanour, and a growing family. He had come for breakfast, looking at her hopefully as she let herself back inside. He had a streak of soot on his cheek. Yelena laughed and tossed him a spare washcloth. He wiped his face ruefully. "What'll it be today, Ivan?" Yelena asked. "You know me, Miss Yelena. I'll have a slice of your spinach and egg tart." "Anything for Nadia or the girls?" Yelena asked. as she cut a thick slice of quiche. Nadia, Ivan's wife, was pregnant with their third child, and by all accounts she was glowing. The couple's first two children were young girls, toddlers really. They were mischievous, lovable little imps who called Yelena Auntie. "She can hardly keep anything down," Ivan replied mournfully, digging deep in his pockets for coins. "Not like our first two, that's for certain. She's convinced we're having an Ivan Jr." "You'd be so lucky," Yelena teased. Ivan guffawed. "But hold on for a second," Yelena added thoughtfully, tapping her cheek with a floury finger. "I have the perfect thing in the pantry." As she bustled into the back storeroom, Yelena heard Ivan take his first bite of quiche, then the second, then the third. She giggled. No matter how much he ate, the blacksmith always seemed to be ravenous. Yelena had learned the quiche recipe from a travelling Frenchman passing through on his way to Moscow. In actual fact, she'd bartered her trademark recipe for Russian tea cakes, and the two bakers had shaken hands and parted ways. The Frenchman swore the quiche was perfect, a result of years upon years in which he tinkered with it. But over time, Yelena had added a few extra ingredients to complement each flavour profile. She always baked by instinct. Chives from the garden, red Russian garlic slow roasted in the sun, a touch of saffron, fresh ground pepper. For the second time that morning, her mouth watered just thinking about it. She had another quiche tucked away in the basket for Andre and Sophia too. She brushed past hanging garlic and sacks of potatoes, enjoying the wafting scent of freshly chaffed wheat. Where was it? Where was it? Ah, yes. Ginger cookies. Perfect for nausea and tasty to boot. Ginger was a rarity in Russia, but Yelena had her sources. Just like the quiche, she had tried the recipe and mixed in her own twist, going by instinct and taste. She had added spicy cloves, ground by hand with her mortar and pestle. She had browned the butter, hoping to achieve a subtle layered flavour of nutty caramel. She had mixed in a dollop of amber honey, a tablespoon of golden syrup, and a sprinkle of pink pepper. And finally, the pièce de résistance, the most prized ingredient in her spice collection. She had added a drop of pure vanilla extract, gifted to her summers ago by Sophia the First herself. Back at the counter, a guilty-looking Ivan was trying to wipe the quiche crumbs off his face. He wasn't having much success. "Maybe another slice then?" he said, looking sheepish. "What have you got there?" "Ginger cookies," Yelena answered briskly, wrapping the sweets in quiche in brown paper and twine. "Now, tell Nadia to eat half a cookie whenever she feels nauseous. If she can have a few bites more, all the better. She can wash it down with some jasmine tea. Those tannins will help too. That should clear any stomach butterflies up in short order." "Oh, bless you," Ivan said as he took the package of goodies. He held out his hand, copper coins in palm. Yelena shook her head and said, "My treat." "I couldn't," Ivan protested, trying to put his money on the countertop. She fixed him with her sternest gaze, the kind that could wither crops and stop men in their tracks. "I insist," she said, and that was that. The sun had fully risen by the time Ivan left, and the town square outside Yelena's pastry shop was warm and pleasant. In the nearby fields, a few children watched clouds drift by, pointing out shapes they could see. A red-headed boy saw a pillow soft as down. A girl with ringlets pointed out a four-poster bed piled high with comforters and quilts. It seemed as though the youngsters had tired themselves out. their eyes drifting shut and their breath slowing. Before long, the children had fallen asleep in a ragtag pile of limbs. Their parents chuckled as they continued their tasks, thanking the universe for errant clouds and the rich imaginations of their offspring. As the day progressed, Yelena began taking inventory of the food at hand. The Demidovs would arrive just before noon, and she needed everything ready for the traditional luncheon feast. She watched the millwright and stonemason carry a long oaken table into the town square, setting it up beside the wishing fountain. Every year, the townspeople and Demidovs gathered around a rich assortment of succulent foods. Before they dug in, Sophia would make a single wish and toss a shiny gold coin into the fountain for luck. Sometimes the Empress wished for mild weather or fruitful crops. Sometimes she wished for prosperity for a struggling family, like the farmer during last year's blight, or the weaver during a particularly difficult pregnancy. Curiously, Sophia's wishes always came true. The farmer woke up one morning to a bag of gold on his doorstep, more than enough to feed his family through the winter. Under the watchful eye of the best midwife in the land, the weaver gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Or perhaps it wasn't so curious. After all, Andre and Sophia were sweethearts, both as rulers and as neighbours. They considered Malinka their family, and the feeling, of course, was mutual. Yelena turned her attention to the kitchen, taking a swift peek at her fruit bread. It was rising beautifully and would be ready for baking just before noon, exactly like she'd planned. Now, time to check the pastries. She started with the savoury treats, setting each batch aside after ticking it off her mental list. There was spelt bread and potato pancakes, rye crackers and spinach tarts. Of course, everything was cooked to perfection. Then there were the pies, countless pies that Sophia would inevitably munch on when she arrived. There was turnip and basil pie, an earthy, deep taste that was best savoured at the back of your tongue. There was mushroom and cabbage pie, a robust but perky flavour, great for introducing reluctant children to healthy vegetables. There was potato and leek pie, a nutty classic with convenient ingredients. Yelena checked on the traditional appetizers next, a collection of Russian fare passed down through the countless generations. It was said that these recipes originated centuries ago, when Russia's Eastern Slavic ancestors settled near the Byzantine Empire. Yelena could believe it. There was something ancient and instinctive about the traditional food spread out on her kitchen counter. There were white kalachas with poppy seeds, a type of refined bread braided into a ring to represent wholeness. It was said that anyone who shared kalachas would fall in love during the next harvest. There were barankas, small rings of yeast-leavened wheat dough that she boiled before baking, making a perfectly chewy texture. They paired exquisitely well with the soft cheeses that Sophia and Andre brought each year. There was the triple batch of pelmeni, soft dumplings, a favourite of Malinka's residents. Next, Yelena bustled over to the fire in the kitchen, checking on a multitude of pots tucked close to the warmth of the fire. As well as Yelena's raisin scones, Andre had a particular penchant for soup. He was always excited for his favourites. There was borscht with strips of beetroot and cabbage, a hearty but zesty meal that made your insides warm on cool summer nights. There was noodle and barley soup steeped in broth, a timeless classic that tasted like home no matter where you ate it. There was thick lentil with shallots and rosemary, best enjoyed on a hunk of dense, seedy bread. Yelena even had a surprise for Andre, a recipe she'd heard from a travelling merchant when she was trading honey cakes for his Venetian cinnamon. Fruit soup. She had to admit she'd raised her eyebrows at first. Who ever heard of sweet soup? But after the first few attempts, she could hardly keep it away from the townspeople. They loved it. And so she'd asked the farmer for fruit from his orchard, and he had delivered. The fruit soup was a sophisticated mix of ripe cherries, tart gooseberries, and brined apples, swirled together with a touch of that hard-won cinnamon and shavings of expensive lemon peel. It was mouth-watering and interesting. Andre was an adventurous eater, and so Yelena knew he'd be pleased. Before continuing inventory, Yelena unwrapped the fruit bread, catching a fragrant waft of elderberry as she tucked it into a warm cast-iron pan. Setting it on top of the wood stove, she took a moment to stretch and breathe. Finding stillness in busy moments was always important. When she was ready, she moved on to check the drink barrels in the storeroom. There were the classics, of course: tangy fruit juices and fragrant rosewater, chilled Russian tea and barley water. Then there were 2 more barrels with more traditional refreshments. Firstly, Oaten Kissel, a fermented rye drink chock full of nutrients. Secondly, there was a refreshing and delicious birch sap drink, which children affectionately called birch juice. Both drinks were hearty and substantial, and it wasn't uncommon that the townspeople would replace early breakfasts with a filling mug of either. It was late in the morning by that point, the sun high in the sky. The residents of Malinka buzzed like bees as they prepared. Whistling cheerfully, the stonemason and millwright set up long benches by the communal table. The seamstress brought a hand-embroidered tablecloth, a surprise project she'd been working on all year. Parents had put their children to work too. One rosy-cheeked boy dusted the wishing fountain, his brow furrowed with concentration, as a blue-eyed girl swept the cobble streets free of dirt and soot. As the final touch, the village musician carefully placed an exquisite bouquet of flowers on the table, full of roses, daisies, peonies, orchids, lilies, and marigolds. Sophia had a famous love for flowers, and this was a centerpiece fit for royalty. Soon the town square was spotless. The air was pleasant and warm, and the delicious scent of freshly baked bread began to permeate the streets. The townspeople grinned. "Mistress Yelena outdid herself once again," they said to each other gleefully. "Do you smell that? Mistress Yelena has done it again." The smell of freshly baked bread was so wholesome and fulfilling, Yelena mused. It permeated the senses. No matter how bad your day had been, freshly baked bread would make it better. She finished up her inventory with the sweet baked goods. There were quite a few of them. Sophia and Andre had an infamous sweet tooth. There were raisin scones and apple fritters, Russian shortbread and jam cookies, walnut loaves and carrot squares. There was rugala, a delicious twisted pastry filled with nuts and fruit, buttery to the taste and crumbly to the touch. There was kartoshka, little cake pops decorated with halved chestnuts and rose petals. They melted on your tongue in moments. Yelena had set aside 2 special batches of rugala and kartoshka, saving the treats for the Romanovs' household. Their butler, a lovely fellow who took his manner etiquette very seriously, swore up and down that Yelena's baking was exactly like his mother's as a child, she took it to heart. Last, but certainly not least, Yelena checked her cakes. If she had to pick her favorite dessert, it was cakes, without hesitation. They were versatile, delicious, and unifying. Anyone could have a conversation over a slice of cake, and she intended on facilitating exactly that. There was honey cake, moist and buttery, served with dollops of hand-churned cream for the perfect bite. There was spice cake, strong and bursting with flavors like cinnamon, nutmeg, ginger, and cloves. There was waffle cake, a traditional Russian dessert made with rich ingredients like caramel syrup, a delicacy Yelena had ordered from the capital specifically for the imperial family. And then there was the cake to end all cakes. There was the Russian royal cake, also called Korolevsky, or aptly, the king's cake. This cake was luxury personified, a triple-layered treat with distinctive flavor profiles in each tier. The bottom layer was walnut and cream, thick and full of moisture. The second tier was Dutch chocolate, velvety and decadent. The third tier was poppy seed and refined white flour, light and airy. Yelena had decorated each layer with frosted roses, daisies, peonies, orchids, lilies, and marigolds, the same flowers that now rested at the center of the town square. The cake looked like an edible meadow. Popping out of the shop, Yelena waved the carpenter and mayor over. She loaded them up with heaps of food, smiling when their stomachs growled, and directed them to take the food outside. The townspeople stopped and watched the mouth-watering procession. Some were slack-jawed, others giggled with glee. Still more rubbed their stomachs, squeezing Yelena's shoulder as she passed by with the Russian royal cake carefully balanced on a platter. With the feast ready, there was only one last thing to check: the fruit bread. Yelena bustled over to the wood stove, her eye on the fruit bread. It appeared to be slightly undercooked, but when she knocked on the bread's crumb, the loaf sounded hollow. In cases like these, it's always better to go with the way the crumb sounded instead of the way it looked. She smiled and silently congratulated herself. The bread was ready. The dough would saturate in its own fruit juices, taking on even more flavor as it cooled. Yelena wrapped it in a swathe of clean linen and tucked it beside the other treats meant for Sophia and Andre. She stood back to admire her handiwork. Doubtless, the Demidovs would love it all. Then, the townspeople of Malinka heard it. The clip-clop of hooves on the street. The wooden knocking of carriage wheels navigating the cobblestones. The tinkling, light-hearted laugh of Sophia the First herself, and the dulcet chuckle of Andre the Great. And just like that, the town of Malinka welcomed the Tsar and Empress of Russia, and the summer season officially began. Yelena hitched the basket of goodies on her hip and strolled out to greet Sophia and Andre in person. The Empress was saying hello to the children as Yelena approached, patting each one on the head cheerfully. "Happy solstice," Sophia said merrily. "You've all grown so much." Then she saw Yelena, and her eyes lit up. The Empress rushed over to the baker, enveloping her in a tight hug. Yelena returned the embrace, laughing. "Welcome back," she told Sophia, presenting the basket with a flourish. "Oh, you spoil me," Sophia said playfully. If I can't spoil an empress, who else would it be? Yelena replied. Sophia laughed. Behind his wife, Andrei waved, his eyes already on the luncheon feast. It seemed that the Demidovs had arrived with their appetites. The townspeople settled around the table, their spirits high. Andrei took his customary seat at one head of the table, and Sophia took the other. Before they could settle in, though, there was one last thing to do. With a flourish, Sophia presented the shiny gold coin. It was time for the Empress to make a wish.
Wish for chocolate,
a child shouted, and the townspeople tittered. Do not worry. I'll give you chocolate, Sophia promised. Then she held the coin high above her head. Every year, Malinka greets my husband and I with open arms, warm hugs, and more food than we know what to do with. I know how much care and effort goes into your preparation, and so this year, I'd like to wish for magnificent, restful sleep for each and every one of you. I wish for good nights and sweet dreams. She flipped the coin into the fountain. It landed with a glint and a splash. Yelena smiled. A night of rest sounded wonderful on such a warm summer's day. And just like the Empress had said, everyone in Malinka slept well that night, and all the nights that followed. On this note, our story ends. Good night and sweet dreams.